Hi everyone, and welcome to this quick tutorial on how to use API keys with Amazon Bedrock. Now, if you're not aware, AWS has recently launched this new feature. What it essentially allows you to do is access the Amazon Bedrock API keys in a much simpler way than you would in the traditional IAM sense. It is not a replacement for IAM. You can still access the Bedrock APIs in the typical fashion. But now they've just made it a little bit simpler because I guess they've recognized that it's a little bit tricky for people who are new to AWS to set up all of the credentials and all of that good stuff. The announcement blog is here, and I've posted it in a link below. And it goes through a lot of the details about this release. One of them specifically to pay attention to is this diagram. So the part on the left shows the typical way that you would access Amazon Bedrock. It usually involves creating a user or a role, and then you get two credentials, which is essentially the API access key and the API secret key. But instead, they've now got the simpler way, which you can see on the right. You still have to create permissions. You still have to create a user, but instead you can create a specific API key with a certain time period. And that's just a single string that you can put into your application and use directly. So that whether that's a third party or your own code. So now I'm going to go into how to do it. So what you need to do is you need to, first of all, head over to the AWS console. So I've assumed that you've already set up a console. If not, go into the documentation and set that up. From here, we're going to go over to IAM. IAM is where all of your users, roles, policies are stored. And it's how you can manage how access is granted across AWS. So for this tutorial, we're going to go to users and we're going to create a new user. So for the username, it can be anything, but I would recommend as a best practice to make it something that's descriptive about the application that's accessing this API. So if it's a third-party application, you maybe want to give it the name of that. If it's a CI/CD process or some sort of automation tool that you're using that's outside of your AWS infrastructure, I would give it that name. If it's a developer or someone that's in your organization that's going to be accessing the application, I would maybe name it after that person or whatever their identifier is internally. But for this example, I'm just going to type demo, and you don't need to give access to the AWS Management Console because this is going to be something that's going to only require access from an API. So we'll go to next from here. So similar to what would happen with typical IAM, with the API keys, you do also still need to attach policies to the user so that you can grant so you can give permission on what they can and cannot do with this API key. So for this demo, we're going to go to attach policies directly. And what I can recommend is, especially if you're starting out for the first time, just type in Bedrock. And there is a policy specifically called Amazon Bedrock Limited Access. And if you press this little plus button, you can actually see what it gives access to. And the two things that are sort of most important for accessing from application code is the call with bearer token over here and the invoke model. So those two different pieces will allow any sort of application code to access Amazon Bedrock. So I'm going to just check this box here to add that as to our role, and then I'm just going to go to next. Here you just have a sort of overview page. What I'd recommend is if it's a specific project that you're working with, I'd maybe give it a descriptive project tag. So I'm just going to say demo. This helps later down the line if you want to do things like attributing different billing to a specific project. You can do that through tags later down the line, but it's by all means, it's optional. So just head over to create user once you're ready. So now that our user is created, the next step is we want to go and create that API key. So we'll start by opening up the demo user that we've just created. You can see the permissions that we've granted. We can see the ARN over here. That's not important for this session. We're going to go over to security credentials. And if we scroll down, we get to the API keys for Amazon Bedrock section over here. So here, we're going to go to generate API key. And we're going to give it a specific day, number of days for expiration. So as a best practice, I'd try and make this as low as possible. So if you're only going to be requiring access for, say, 30 days, I'd set it to 30 days. Maybe for the demo or just testing this out, maybe set it to 5 days. Bear in mind that if you have no expiry date and this token does get into the wrong hands, it could mean that someone else could access your APIs, and you could also rack up quite a bad bill. So if you do have it as non-expiring, then I would make sure that you just keep that API key safe. You can, if that happens, just disable the API key, but sometimes it can cause a little bit of mayhem in the background. So I'm going to just set this to 5 days, or actually I'll set it to 1 day for now. And I'm going to click to generate API key. So here you get the overview panel of the API key you've just generated. We can see the demo name that we gave it. We can see the account ID over here. We can see when it expires. And we can also see things like the API key itself. It gives a little bit of a hint on how you would set this in your code. So you can choose one of these options below. I'll show you how to set it up into Python as well. So what we'll do is we'll just copy this over here. Just before I go close the session, I'll just have another thing to just draw your attention to. So over here, you can see that with this way of accessing APIs, you can only have a maximum of 2 long-term API keys at a time. That's per user. The reason why this is that usually you want to have one that's active, that you're actively using, and one that you might want to rotate into your application at some point. So for instance, in a typical key rotation process, you usually have one that's active. You'll bring in another key. So you'll have 2 that's active at the same time. You will update your code to have that second key, and then you'll disable the previous first key. And what that does is that allows you to that if anything in your system breaks, you can just re-enable it and you can manage that process a little bit better. So the maximum is 2. You can always delete one, add another one, but you can also create multiple users. So especially if you have multiple systems that's accessing your APIs, I would maybe have 1 user per each of those systems. That also helps just with auditing in general. So the last thing we're going to do before we go over to the code is we're going to head over to the Bedrock console itself. This is something, especially if you've just created an account for the first time, as you're going to have to go over to Bedrock. Pay attention to the region that you're in, because what we're going to do now is just enable models for that region that you're in. And so what you need to do is you go scroll all the way down to the bottom over here on the left panel, model access. The reason why I say look at the region is because certain models are only available in certain regions. You can go over to the docs to figure out which models are available in which. I'm using the Ireland region. It's just because I'm based in the UK, so this is where I usually have all of my stuff. And what you need to do is just make sure that the models that you're going to access have been granted. So for instance, here for Cohere, Meta, these are not available. So if I was to call via the APIs, I would get an access denied or a model not available message. So the way that you enable is you go to modify model access. You select the models that you want to have access to. So if you're managing a team, you want to maybe specifically set which models your team have access to. I'm using Claude for this demo, so I've just made sure that they're all enabled. And then I'll click next, and obviously I have already enabled them, so it will then. But you go next, and you will get to a point where you have these models access granted. And that'll just allow us to have access to Bedrock once the API key has authenticated. Cool, so that's it for the console. Let's head over to the code to show you how to use the API key that we've got. So here we've got a typical piece of code. It's just a simple Python application. All it does is invoke Claude Haiku. I'm going to give it some user input, and it's going to use the Converse API in the Boto3 SDK. So Boto3, if you're new to AWS, is basically the SDK that you use to access all of AWS applications and services. And so you typically install it with pip, and you can just enable it. I've got the code. I've put it into a gist, so you can have a look at that code and feel free to use it in your own project. The other thing that's just like a nice to have is I'm using this .env package. So if you're not familiar with that, what that means is it's basically going to take your .env file in your product directory, and it's going to expose all of the environment variables that you set in this file into your application. This is nice because it just enables you to sort of change out the API keys without necessarily having to update your code. And especially if you want to deploy into production, you can just update the environment variables and deploy like that. So that's .env. I'm going to set it in the .env file, and the way that you set it is with this environment variable. So AWS bearer token Bedrock, and I'm going to just add the API key over here and save. The last thing to bear in mind is, before we test this, is just to make sure that you've updated your Boto 3 package. So if you're integrating this into an existing or into a sort of older application where you've maybe got older versions of Boto 3, just make sure that you have upgraded it to the latest one, just to make sure that the SDK has the ability to use this token. If you haven't, you might get like an access denied error. So here, what I'm going to do is, now that we've got the environment variable set, I'm just going to run it. I'm going to use UV to do this, UV run main. And if I do that, it's going to install some packages, and I'm going to say, hello, what's up? And in the background, it's going to call. I'm going to get the response from the AI agent over here. So that shows you how you enable it into your application. You can see it's a lot simpler than using AWS IAM identity credentials. The last thing I want to do is just show you how to close off this project if you want to test it at home. So in order to disable access or enable or just delete the user, we're going to head back over to IAM. If we go over to here and we go back to our users, you can go into the user itself and you can delete the security credentials. So you can go over here and go actions, deactivate or delete. So deactivate just means that it's not enabled, but you can still reactivate it if you have applications that need to have access to it that may be breaking your system. I'd say either delete it for this tutorial, or if you want, you can just delete the user entirely. So if I go confirm, delete the user. Now that's deleted. If I run my application code again, you'll see that I'll say, hi, what's cracking? And you'll see you get an access denied because that API key has been removed from that user. So that's the end of the tutorial. Hopefully it's been useful. Hopefully you'll be able to start making use of Amazon Bedrock APIs via the API key mechanism. Stay tuned if you like this, and just give me any feedback. Happy to accept it, and hopefully you have a good day. Cheers.